The storm found the glass first, drumming the newsroom into a metronome of doubt as Mara Khan rehearsed a tease about an old man with a paper-thin legend and a voice like carbon dust. Someone to fill a rainy slot before sports. Elias Ward waited by the coffee machine as if a verdict might pour from it, hands folded, eyes studying the red tally light that could turn mockery into memory. Producer Lila Ortiz scribbled timing cuts while Devin Pike adjusted his tie, smiling the way professionals do when the truth is inconvenient and the clock is cruel. Elias said he had seen a trial that never happened, a gavel that left no dent, a transcript that erased itself. Mara almost grinned because that sounded like poetry, and television does not trust poetry. Then the floor monitors trembled, not from thunder but from a switch no one here controlled. The signal shivered, the chyron froze, and a face larger than weather arrived. President Aurora Vale, unscheduled, unblinking, voice low as a sealed corridor, saying there existed a ledger of vanished voices. And suddenly the joke had an audience with power, and the storm fell silent inside them. The newsroom exhaled as if it had been underwater, and the oxygen that returned carried the metallic taste of consequence. President Aurora Vale, unscheduled and unadorned, spoke carefully about a ledger of voices and an inquiry into sealed dockets, words that hovered between admission and warning before the feed cut without ceremony. Devin cleared his throat and offered the audience a professional apology, while Lila's headset erupted with upstairs orders to resume, as if continuity could sew a torn fabric while the rip still widened. Mara felt Elias watching her, not with triumph but with a grief that asked for patience. The joke she had prepared curdled on her tongue. He murmured that he had typed the names once and knew where their shadows still clung. A courthouse after midnight, a ribbon of carbon, an unclaimed gavel. Mara's pulse found the storm's tempo again, and for the first time tonight she wanted the segment not for spectacle, but for the page that might still be warm. Lila leaned in with the earpiece twisted between her fingers, whispering that the control room wanted a pivot to weather, that advertisers were jittery and legal had already pinged. Devin launched into practiced filler, a tasteful tour of radar greens and storm advisories, while his eyes flicked to Mara and then to Elias like a man reading a future he didn't order. Elias asked for 3 minutes and a glass of water. Mara asked for access to archive footage and a runner to the courthouse. Lila's pencil paused over the rundown as if hovering could buy courage. The lights warmed to a sheen that made everything look honest. Mara remembered her first ethics lecture, how truth was a muscle that atrophies with comfort. She told Lila quietly that if they mocked him now, they might be archiving their own complicity. Outside, a siren slid past. Inside, the clock ticked toward a decision with the relentless patience of justice. The floor manager's countdown began again, numbers falling like elevator floors, and Mara felt the lift in her chest that always comes before choosing. Elias' folder, thin and stubborn, lay open to a single page of nothing but indentations, the ghosts of letters pressed into absence. He described a tribunal convened after custodians clocked out, a judge whose nameplate never met the morning, a stenograph tape swapped for a ribbon that absorbed and forgot. She asked why he waited so long, and he said he had not. He had been dismissed so long that it looked like silence. Devin placed his script down, decision quiet as snowfall. Lila slid a sticky note across Mara's palm. Go. 3 minutes live. No taunts. The storm outside tapped its approval against the glass. Somewhere in the building, a phone began to ring with the persistence of someone who believes they still own the narrative. When the red light found her again, Mara did not perform. She invited. She told the audience that on a night already full of warnings, they would hear a story about a room without minutes and a gavel without an echo, and that the president's sudden address suggested ghosts still pacing the halls of Rec or Dot. Elias lifted his chin, voice steady as courtroom wood, explaining how words once carved were made to evaporate, how he kept a single ribbon that remembered what the page forgot, and how a ledger might still be pieced from negative space. Devon added only a brief human aside, that sometimes news is an apology. Lila's fingers hovered near the cut switch, and then stilled. In the brief hush that followed, Mara saw a figure at the studio door. Detective Jonah Reed, rain-slick and deliberate, holding a cassette that seemed to drink the light, and understood the story had chosen its own time. Detective Jonah Reed set the cassette on the producer's desk, as though placing a fragile animal there, and the newsroom's noise dimmed to the hush of a library with a secret aisle. He said, "It came from a retired bailiff, who kept it out of fear rather than faith, that the man's name should stay buried until they understood the ground." Mara felt the weight of it like a small, stubborn planet tugging her orbit. Elias breathed through his nose, the practiced calm of someone who has waited longer than clocks can count. Devon asked for provenance and chain of custody, and the distance between risk and recklessness. Lila asked how soon they could hear it in a room without windows. Thunder pressed another palm to the glass. The president's interruption hung in the air like a legal citation. No one wanted to read aloud. Reed said the tape was ugly but exact, and that if they played it, the room might not forgive them for pretending it was entertainment. They retreated to edit 2, a room so small it forced honesty, where the hum of aging equipment sounded like a confession about to begin. Lila muted the intercom. Mara eased the cassette into the deck, and Elias rested a hand on the table as if anchoring himself to the present. The tape dragged, then caught, and voices surfaced through static. A clerk reading names that never made it to daylight, a baritone asserting jurisdiction no statute would claim, the scrape of a gavel that belonged to no inventory. "What? Sheen, Martin, inventory. That's your eyes. Shane." Inventory. Someone whispered, "Ledger," as if the word might witness them back. Devon hovered in the doorway, half in, half out, his tie loosened by uncertainty rather than comfort. Reed scribbled times and phrases, building a map from noise. When the room fell quiet again, no one applauded. The silence was not triumph, but custody. Mara said the president had spoken as if she'd heard this exact grain of air. Elias nodded, eyes bright with the terror of being believed. The first email arrived like a fire alarm without smoke. Subject line, "Program integrity notice." Body filled with polite threats wearing the cologne of money. A major advertiser hinted that civic curiosity was admirable, but brand environments mattered more. Devon read it twice, then turned to Lila, his voice measured, the way surgeons speak before incisions. He argued for caution framed as stewardship, that once you cross a line on air, the map you hand the audience might be unreadable. Lila replied that unreadable maps are how the lost stay lost, and if the president had said ledger, either she misspoke or she wanted them to follow. Mara watched the exchange like tennis played on a cliff edge. Reed shrugged that every case chooses its own weather. Elias reached for his folder and offered a single sentence. "Names do not die, they are hidden." The second email arrived colder, invoking legal review and access agreements that felt like handcuffs engraved with their logo. Mara took the stairwell with Reed, the two of them walking the building's spine where paint peeled like old statements. He said the bailiff who saved the cassette now fed pigeons by the courthouse steps and sometimes talked to the thief bronze statue of justice as if she were tired of the blindfold. Outside, rain stitched the streets together. Reed warned that Silas Crane's people would hear echoes and send someone to absorb the sound. Their city had a way of rewarding amnesia with grants and gala tickets. Mara thought of the indentations in Elias's page, of words that exist by the pressure they leave behind. She asked Reed why he still helped, when suspension was the likely prize. He said a detective is just a conscience with paperwork, and tonight's form was already filled. They planned a dawn visit to the courthouse records annex, quiet as a chapel for paper. Above them, thunder rolled like a stamp across a ledger that refused to stay blank. By midnight, the newsroom felt like a ship riding its ballast of secrets. Lila red-drafted the rundown to carve a quiet segment for context, while Devon phoned legal and spoke with the careful diction of someone stepping through. Less. The third message landed with a false smile. Silas Crane's office offering an exclusive interview if they abandoned unverified theatrics. Attached was a reminder of their satellite carriage contract. A velvet glove fitted perfectly over a fist. Mara printed it and slid it into Elias's folder alongside the page of indentations. Evidence now conversing with evidence. Reed outlined the plan. At dawn, annex. At noon, cross-check retired docket numbers. At night, decide if the heir belongs to fear or to record. Elias said the ledger was not an object but a promise, and promises once spoken do not go back to sleep. The storm eased, leaving a quieter, truer sound, the building settling into the choice it would have to live with. Dawn peeled the city back to its bones as Mara and Reed met Elias on the courthouse steps. The bronze justice glistening like she'd wept all night. Inside the record's annex, dust floated in columns of pale light that felt almost ecclesiastical, and the clerk's bell gave a tired chime as if absolution had business hours. Elias guided them by memory more than signage, down a corridor where the carpet grew thin and the fluorescents hummed like nervous bees. He asked for a box labeled with a docket that should not exist, and when the clerk returned with nothing, he asked instead for maintenance logs, the kind that list rooms no one advertises. The pages whispered room 4 after hours. A notation crossed out so hard the paper bruised. Mara's heartbeat found that old metronome of rain. Elias said that the last time he walked this hall, it was 2 in the morning, and a judge with no nameplate had asked him whether his hands were steady. They were. They still were. Room 4 had been rebadged as a storage closet, but the door still wore a brass scar where a plaque once lived. Inside, the smell of old carpet and older secrets pressed against them. Reed lifted a mop bucket and found a shallow groove in the floor, the kind a heavy table leaves when it anchors something heavier still. Elias closed his eyes and described the tribunal like a man sketching from a faded photograph. 6 chairs, 2 lamps, a clock that had been stopped at 11:59, as if midnight were a jurisdiction they refused to enter. A woman's voice, firm, exhausted, had read charges of disloyal dissemination, while he typed into a machine he didn't recognize, its ribbon swallowing ink into silence. Mara touched the groove, hearing without hearing the scrape of a gavel that never made audit. She asked who sat in the 6th chair. Elias said no one. That absence had the authority of a person. Reed wrote that down as if it were evidence. They followed the paper's negative space. Requisitions with missing signatures, inventory sheets noting a gavel purchased but never returned, and a delivery manifest for a portable stenograph labeled Silent Test. Return to sender. Elias's voice softened as he remembered his younger body, 53, brisk with obedience. Ushered past a custodian who didn't look up. He had typed names that trembled as they arrived, whistleblowers from agencies that prefer initials to identities. And when the judge spoke the word ledger, everyone held their breath like accomplices. Mara imagined the vanished. A systems auditor, a satellite tech, a clerk who fell in love with procedure, all reduced to initials and then to erasure. Reed called an old friend at facilities who confirmed that for us, electricity drew peak load on 3 nights that month. Always after midnight, the facts began to mesh like gears, and the teeth that caught were sharp enough to bleed a newsroom. Mara asked Elias what happened after the last name was read, and the room tilted into memory. The woman with the exhausted voice declared, "Protective custody of public trust," a phrase that tasted like metal, and a man in a suit without insignia said the ledger would be reconciled off the record. Elias handed over his ribbon, but his hands were practiced in duplicates, and the carbon he kept was the one that remembered. He said he hid it in a dictionary under veracity, a private joke against a public machine. Reed asked about the sixth chair again, why it stayed empty. Elias replied that sometimes power needs a vacancy to sit in. Mara felt the story crystallize into a thesis. That absence is an instrument, and silence a policy. She looked at the clock, real, moving, and knew that if they broadcast, they would be naming not just villains but a method. Outside, the rain had thinned to a confession. Back at the station, Lila had turned a conference room into a war room. Whiteboard spines of timelines, sticky notes like constellations, and Devon arrived carrying a printout of carriage clauses that read like handcuffs. They laid the tribunal's bones on the table. Room 4 rebadged, electricity spikes, a gavel that never came home, a ribbon that remembers, an empty chair with authority. Devon said on air they would need one undeniable artifact, not just inference. Mara promised the artifact would speak in negative relief, and Elias slid the carbon ribbon onto a velvet cloth Lila found in a prop drawer. Reed proposed a lab shot under oblique light to pull up the ghosts of letters. Lila scheduled it against the evening block, building a glass case in the rundown where truth could stand. The president's words, the ledger of vanished voices, now felt less like mystery and more like a dare. Somewhere downtown, Silas Crane would already be dialing. The emails stopped being polite and became arithmetic. Lines of lost revenue, columns of threatened carriage, percentages that looked like cuffs. Then Silas Crane's assistant requested a collegial alignment call, and within minutes his voice slid into Devon's earpiece with the warmth of a winter sun, offering an exclusive that would recenter the narrative if they abandoned their folklore. Devon mouthed he was just listening while Lila, arms folded, counted breaths that might as well have been boundaries. Mara felt the room tilt toward caution, the way a ship lists toward whatever owns the tide. Elias stood beside the velvet cloth, where the carbon ribbon rested like a relic, watching their faces choose between career and conscience. Reed, patched in from his car, warned that pressure always claims to be prudence, and that leverage travels faster than evidence. Silas concluded with an almost kind reminder of the claws that could go dark their uplink. The line clicked. The thunder didn't. It began inside the room. They were summoned upstairs, where carpeting muffled rebellion and framed awards reminded visitors who paid the electric bill. Network counsel Ruth Bell, a woman with snowy hair and eyes like stapled pages, invited them to sit, indicted them to sit. Speak as if candor were a safe hobby. She outlined exposure, defamation risk, tortious interference, inducement claims, the alphabet of litigation that turns truth into homework. Devon asked about thresholds and corroboration. Lila asked about moral urgency. Mara asked whether the president's phrase could be treated as an official predicate. Bell paused long enough to betray interest before reciting that executive language does not sanctify speculation. Elias raised his hand, quiet, schoolboy neat, and said he knew the difference between rumor and record because one erases and the other bruises paper. The room blinked. Bell conceded that if they could name a sealed docket, a conversation might change its weight. They left lighter and heavier at once, the way people do when given both a door and a lock. Back in Edit 2, Mara replayed the president's address frame by frame, not for scandal but for syntax. When Aurora Vale said, "Ledger of vanished voices," her cadence tucked the word ledger against a precise breath. The way attorney's couch terms of art. Dial. Mara cross-referenced Elias's maintenance logs and Reed's power spikes with a court indexing quirk. Elias recalled. Sealed matters are filed under Valve. Limited visibility, with a suffix that mirrors the initiating agency's shorthand. Voices, visibility, ledger, VVL. She pulled an old press kit from a judiciary reform week, where a pamphlet used the phrase visibility ledger to describe internal audits. Lila mapped dates. Elias reconstructed the night's timing. Reed texted a contact at records with the bait of a typo only insiders make. The puzzle clicked. LV Vox 17, a naming convention that tasted like Ozo. Mara felt the thrill of being close enough to scare herself. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was reading a whisper that wanted to be heard. The elevator stalled on the garage level with a polite chime that sounded like a dare. When the doors opened, the night smelled of oil and rain. A dim cathedral of concrete, where footsteps multiply. Reed was waiting by a column. The brim of his hood jeweled with drizzle, and he didn't waste time. A black sedan had idled near the loading dock for 20 minutes. Tags registered to a shell company that rhymed with one of Silas. He handed Mara a small pouch, privacy sleeves for phones, the detective's version of a prayer, and reminded her that intimidation prefers soft light and plausible deniability. Elias joined them with the deliberate calm of someone who refuses to be hurried by fear. They walked together toward the exit. No sprint, no heroics, just the disciplined pace of people who know stories and danger both reward rhythm. The sedan's lights blinked, then died. Somewhere above them, thunder rehearsed a line it intended to deliver later. The fracture arrived without shouting. Devon drafted a backup rundown that buried the tribunal beneath lifestyle, and Lila, eyes glass bright but unblinking, slid it back with a quiet no. Mara placed LV Vox 17 at the top of the whiteboard like a banner, and Elias added 3 initials he remembered by the way their carriers trembled. NR, JT, SM. Reed's contact confirmed a sealed entry matching their pattern, created on a Friday night at 11:59 p.m. The jurisdiction of almost. Devon stared at the timestamp as if it were a mirror. He said the choice might cost people their jobs. Lila said the other choice already had. Mara promised they would go for artifact, not accusation. Elias promised the ribbon would speak. Reed promised to stand in the blast radius. The room settled into a new gravity. They would aim the evening broadcast like a scalpel and invite the nation to watch the cut. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and the city listened. The courthouse at pre-dawn felt like a throat clearing, marbles swallowing their footfalls as Mara, Elias, and Reed slipped past the sleeping metal detector with keys borrowed from a janitor who preferred not to know their names. The air tasted like polish and paperwork, that peculiar civic incense. Reed's suspension message had arrived an hour earlier, administrative leave pending inquiry, so he wore it like an invisible badge that glowed hotter than his temper. Elias led, not fast, just inexorable. Memory substituting for signage as they moved through a service corridor, where paint blistered in patterns that once framed official notices. At Archive B, the light refused the switch until Reed coaxed the breaker, and rows of gray cabinets rose like pews. Mara thought of the president's phrase and how language can be a lantern if you let it burn long enough. They pulled drawer after drawer, finding dockets that aligned like teeth and gaps that aligned like wounds. When Elias touched a box stamped LV, the lock did not resist. It apologized. Inside, there were no transcripts, only the shadows of their shapes. Folders with tabs shaved off, forms with signature lines amputated, a chorus of absences arranged with bureaucratic care. Mara laid a velvet cloth on the floor, Lila's prop repurposed as a reliquary, and set each artifact that wasn't there upon it, naming them aloud the way you count a prayer's beads. Requisition unstated. Evidence unlogged. Witness unspecified. Elias produced a flat envelope that had lived too long beneath his mattress and drew out the carbon ribbon, dark as a river at midnight. Reed angled his flashlight obliquely, and the negative letters began to glimmer, like constellations refusing to stay dead. They photographed what wasn't, then photographed what was, building a case of pressure marks and missing staples, an indictment written in the grammar of omission. Mara felt fear creep up her spine, but also something steadier, the sense that truth once cornered will not bite. It will exhale and stand. They needed proof that sang louder than photographs, so Reed jimmied the maintenance door to the basement lab where an ancient microfilm reader gathered dust beside a forensic copy stand. He muttered that suspension meant rules. Looked different in the mirror. Mara set the ribbon under glass and adjusted angle and distance until the indented vowels lifted like bruises, admitting the shape that made them. Elias whispered each name as it revealed itself. Nadia Ruiz, Joel Turner, Samir Malik. The initials from his memory, now full-bodied and breathing. Their syllables weighted with lives, paused, but not erased. The images captured in sequence formed a ledger not by ink, but by the stubborn negative. Mara's hands shook, then steadied, because the work was sacred, even if the room was not. When the printer spat out the first legible frame, it sounded like a verdict unsealing. Reed pocketed a copy, sober as a pallbearer. Above them, somewhere distant, a door slammed that no one had opened. The door slam arrived again, nearer this time, followed by the authoritative hush of men who practice being quiet. Reed snapped the lamp off and gestured them into the shadow carved by filing cabinets. 2 security officers swept the corridor, with flashlights too casual to be casual. One spoke into a radio using a call sign that belonged to private contractors, not courthouse staff. Mara counted breaths and thought of Silas Crane's velvet threats, of how power hires silence by the hour. Elias steadied her forearm, a touch that said we've already lived through the worst part, which is not being believed. When the lights faded, they moved with the discipline of a whispered plan. Ribbon sealed, prints pocketed, door eased. Stairwell chosen over elevator. On the landing, Reed's phone vibrated through its privacy sleeve with a single text from Lila. Legal arming, go fast. They did, but without panic, because Haysleeve's fingerprints and tonight the only marks allowed were the ones the ribbon had chosen to keep. By noon, the station vibrated with incoming demands dressed as suggestions. Council wanted to see every frame. Advertisers offered creative alternatives, and a polite courier left a cease and desist that smelled like fresh toner and fear. Then the network president suspended Reed's media credentials, pending review, a punishment without jurisdiction that still stung. He shrugged, placing his badge beside the ribbon like a tie. Lila carved a segment titled, Record of What's Missing. A glass case in the rundown, where the public could watch negative letters become names, while Devon rehearsed a preamble wired to ethics instead of optics. Mara wrote the line that would carry them. Absence is not a lack of truth. It is the shape truth leaves when forced to move. Elias sat in the corner and practiced saying each recovered name without breaking. As the studio lights warmed, the city felt poised on the hinge of a door. They were about to knock, not ask permission, and let the room decide its courage on air. Evening pressed its face against the glass as the countdown threaded the control room with nerves, and Mara felt the shape of the city gather in her chest while Lila rerouted their uplink through a backup dish that hummed like a secret spine. A technician muttered about permissions, and she answered with a quiet, "Whoa in the sky" for 3 minutes, hands steady over a console that had never been this brave. Devon rehearsed the intro once, then set the paper aside as if trusting his own marrow, while Elias perched beside the carbon ribbon, lips forming names like a rosary he had finally earned. Reed stood off camera in the shadows, stripped of credentials but not of gravity, watching doors, watching faces, a sentinel with tired eyes and a steady pulse. The network chat scrolled with warnings dressed as etiquette, yet the red light brightened as if choosing them back. Mara pictured the empty 6th chair and realized tonight they were inviting the vacancy to answer for itself. Live. The ambush interview was less a trap than a door held open. Mara introduced Lorraine Keats, 52 and careful, a former clerk whose end-ass sounded like chains when she breathed, and asked only if the phrase, protective custody of public trust, belonged to law or theater. Lorraine blinked, shoulders tightening beneath a thrift store blazer, then said it was a costume word used in rooms that wanted to sound lawful while doing something else. She remembered a judge without a nameplate, and a list of initials that arrived folded so small they seemed ashamed of themselves. Devon did not interrupt. Lila rode audio like a violinist coaxing truth from air. Lorraine glanced at the ribbon on the velvet and said she once supplied a spare to a stenographer with steady hands and a shaken face, and she had regretted not following him down the hall. The studio held its breath with the country. Mara thanked her, and in the quiet afterward, the ledger felt less like rumor and more like inventory. During the break, that didn't feel like one. A new window opened on the multi-view. The President's Counsel, Marcus Hale, 58, and Hawk Quiet, offering a remote comment that smelled of caveat and oath. Devon took it with a tone that bent towards ceremony. Hale's face hovered against a government gray backdrop as he said no administration condoned shadow tribunals, then added that certain sealed matters bore classification codes that had wandered. Wandered was the word a parent uses when they know the child is missing. Mara asked whether LVVOC 17 was among those codes. Hale did not blink, only said that the president believed in daylight and that remedies were being prepared for unsealing. Lila threw a glance that meant clip it, save it, shield it. Elias closed his eyes, letting the syllables stitch a bandage across years. Reed murmured that remedies arrive only after wounds. The red light returned, and this time it felt less like heat and more like a verdict walking toward them. They rolled the segment titled Record of What's Missing, and the room changed shape. Under angled light, the carbon ribbon exhaled its constellations, and the names rose like islands from a receding tide. Nadia Ruiz, Joel Turner, Samir Malik, each paired with the charge read on the cassette, and the hour the electricity spiked in furor. Devon's voice carried the cadence of a eulogy learning to hope, while Mara explained that absence can be engineered and yet still betray its authors. And Lila overlaid a graphic of the empty sixth chair, a silhouette labeled Authority. Elias spoke each name once, then again, the second time softer, as if laying them gently back where they belonged. The chat tried to flood, but the uplink held. Reed's eyes tracked the corridor where trouble would arrive, if it intended to. Somewhere beneath the floor, it felt like wires bent toward daylight, like a building learning to prefer transparency to power. The last card was not planned. As Devon prepared a measured close, the monitors split and the seal of the Republic replaced their lower third. The President herself, the storm-steady Aurora Vale, appeared with eyes that carried both apology and order, declaring that certain sealed dockets, including LBOVOC 17, would be opened by executive petition to the court within the hour, and that any intimidation of press or witnesses would be prosecuted as obstruction. The studio did not move. Lila's hand hovered above the cut and chose stillness. Devon found a single word. Understood. And let it be enough. Mara looked at Elias, who looked at the camera, who looked at a nation, and in that triangulation something old finally exhaled. Reed lowered his shoulders, not in surrender but in relief, at a doorway that had decided to be a door. The red light faded like a benediction, and for the first time tonight, the silence that followed felt like a room taking an oath. Morning arrived without rain. A clean, unspectacular light that looked like due process, and the courthouse steps were already growing a small forest of microphones when the clerk slipped stamped notice to the front. LV, Vox 17, unsealed. Mara felt the paper's dry edge like a horizon under her thumb. Elias stood beside her, neck straight, as Detective Reed scanned the periphery, with the easy fatigue of someone who finally gets to stop bracing for impact. Devon and Lila coordinated the field, hit with the gentleness of surgeons, making space for truth, not spectacle. The petition's language was plain and brutal. Names returned to ink, charges rescinded, protective custody of public trust, condemned as extra-legal theater. A man from Silas Crane's shop tried to frame the narrative, and found his voice slipping on the new ground. Mara read aloud 3 exonerations and 1 apology signed by the court. Elias nodded once, as if a long, stubborn hinge had finished turning, and the door agreed to stay open. Inside the packed courtroom, the judge, this one named Robed Real, read the findings into a record that felt like a river finally reclaiming its course. The ledger, she said, had been used as a pretext, an instrument for silencing under cover of invented procedure. The empty 6th chair had not been person, but policy, an administrative phantom, mobilized to erase dissent. Mara watched Lorraine Keats in the gallery grip the rail with both hands, knuckles pale, then pink again. Reed stood in the aisle, uninvited but unremoved, and when the judge praised the newsroom's civic persistence, Devin blinked once, surprised into humility. Lila captured reaction instead of triumph. Nadia Rui's relieved laughter. Joel Turner's stunned quiet. Samir Malik's mother folding a tissue into origami, as if giving shape to grief helped it leave. Elias listened like a craftsman measuring a finish, his breath steadying on each restored syllable. On the record, absence lost its case. In the hall beyond, the building exhaled dust and old habits. By afternoon, the towers turned reflective, newscasters speaking each other's names like citations, and Silas Crane's network issued a statement, salted with synonyms for B. Miss Second Shoe Fell. Board inquiry, advertiser walkouts, a deposition schedule that read like a drumline. Devin went live with a measured monologue about the difference between coverage and courage, and a rare smile reached his eyes when he admitted he'd needed reminding. Lila announced an open-source archive. The ribbon scans, the maintenance logs, the electricity spikes, all tagged and searchable. A commons built from what secrecy tried to hoard. Mara recorded a field piece at the bronze statue of justice, no blindfold today, saying that law is a tool, and truth is a practice, and neither works without hands. Elias declined interviews longer than 2 questions. He said the story belonged to those whose names had been unburied, and he had one job left: to return a dictionary to a shelf under V with gratitude. Night returned with clarity instead of threat. The president addressed the nation from a simple desk, announcing an emergency commission to audit, sealed dockets, and a whistleblower protection expansion that sounded less like politics and more like repair. She thanked citizens of record, clerks, custodians, reporters, and one unnamed stenographer for insisting that daylight is a public utility. Reed, reinstated by morning memo, watched from the back of the newsroom with a smile that barely showed, as if relief should be spent sparingly. Devin led a roundtable without spectacle, inviting Lorraine and a public defender to talk about how to keep rooms honest when no one is looking. Lila's rundown left space for names to breathe. Mara felt the city's tempo slow to a human rhythm and caught herself laughing at nothing, the body's way of returning home. Elias stood at the window, rainless glass reflecting his face next to the president's, and whispered thank you to no one in particular. They closed the broadcast not with a crescendo but with a ledger of thanks, to witnesses who kept faith with paper, to viewers who understood that entertainment can wait its turn, to those who will check the room when the cameras leave. Duh. Devin signed off simply. Lila faded the lights a shade but left the set warm as a porch. Reed walked Elias to the door where night smelled like whetstone even without rain. Mara lingered by the empty 6th chair graphic now stored as a template named Accountability, then found Elias at the curb holding the small cassette as if it were finally only plastic and memory. He said that once he'd failed to type one last page because fear carried the room. Tonight, the page typed itself. Mara promised she would spend whatever years she had making sure rooms remembered. The city hummed ordinary again, which felt like a victory. Somewhere far off, Thunder rehearsed another story, and they were ready.